This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Now, Michael, I was a little bit disconcerted when I read the outline or the way this event was promoted because we want to obviously leave time for questions at the end of the hour, and the ad says that we're discussing whether social justice is dead, the future of global education, online learning, the prospects for global public discourse, and the idea of the common good in an age of market. So by my maths, you've got to solve each of those in about 8 minutes.
I've got it.
All right,
All right,
let's get into it, hey?
Okay, I'm ready.
Obviously, the initiating point for this discussion is your latest book, What Money Can't Buy. And you argue in the book that there are some precious things which are corroded by the application of market values. So I wanted to start by asking you, how is this event corroded by the $20 price tag? And I'm not bitter, but why is it corroded $20 less than your event last night?
I see. Yeah. It's the first I've heard of this. I'm worried about it. I think that money can corrupt when it crowds out other values, non-material values, non-market values. And so I think any time we introduce money and market values into a civic practice or occasion, we need to worry about it. And I think in a case like this, we don't need to worry too much, but if it turned out that the fees for attending events at the Sydney Writers' Festival were prohibitive for people of modest means, then I think people would begin to
And I mean,
worry.
almost by definition, they are at some level, aren't they? There will be people around who might be very much interested in your thoughts, but may not be able to afford a $20 price tag to come down to the Sydney Writers' Festival.
Well, that would worry me. The fact that we have online access, and in this case, thanks to ABC for making it more widely available, alleviates that to some degree. But my broader concern in the book is with the small choices we make throughout social life, any one of which may seem inconsequential, but when you add them up, and when you notice that the momentum behind a certain market faith has been increasing over the past 3 decades, pretty soon we look up and we find that there are fewer and fewer public spaces, common places that bring people together in the ordinary course of life to discuss ideas or to shop in downtown areas or to view sporting events together across social backgrounds and walks of life. That's when I think we need to worry. And I think in many of our societies, we have begun to reach that point.
Okay. One of the things that is fascinating about the book is that it's a really powerful accumulation of examples that seem to me to do 2 things. One, they show how all-pervasive market values are, and you also collect some really fine extreme cases, things where, you know, the market's gone much further than any of us might have expected. And I was interested to ask you, what was it? Can you recall when you started collecting these things, noticing them, observing a pattern? Was there something that set you off on that course?
I've been gathering the stories and examples that make up the book for about 25 years. When I first conceived this project, I wish I could say that when the financial crisis hit, I thought, gee, we must start talking about this, and so I began. But I've been thinking about this for a long time. I've been struck by the range of settings in everyday life where, just in the past 30 years roughly, market values increasingly dominate. And so I've been gathering these stories over that time because I think the best way to do philosophy, and this really is, in the end, a book about philosophy, but I think the best way to do it, to try to address citizens generally, to invite them to think about where we've come, is to do it through stories and examples. So it's not a book that's written just for fellow philosophers. It makes the philosophical arguments through the use of dilemmas, stories, examples, some extreme, some closer calls.
Yeah, because you define part of your task as, if you like, providing the philosophical framework for these sorts of discussions. Right. And obviously the technique you've chosen is those examples. One of the things I found myself kind of emerging as a nagging question during the book is, well, what criteria do you apply for the question of whether or not the application of market values is appropriate? Or what is it that is inherent in particular events which makes them kind of prone to degradation by monetary value? The book certainly poses the question and seems to suggest some answers. But do you have kind of broad rules for how we can assess those?
Right, two broad principles. I'm not sure they're rules, because just as you say, Julian, the point of the book is not to lay down the right answer to all of these cases, but to invite and encourage and to promote, even provoke, public debate about them. But there are two broad principles. Whenever deciding whether to put a price on something that's hitherto been governed by other values, we, I think, should ask two questions. One is, how free really is the choice that the two parties to the deal make? One of the great arguments in favor of markets and market relations is that they seem to express a certain conception of freedom, freedom of choice. If you have a car and I need a car, we negotiate, we reach a price, make a deal. Each of us is at least presumptively free to choose for ourselves what values to place on the goods we exchange, the car in this case. But where we're not talking about cars and toasters and flat-screen televisions, but about surrogate motherhood, paid pregnancy, or whether there should be a free market in kidneys for transplantation, or whether we should outsource war to mercenary armies, when we're discussing non-material goods and social practices, then we have to ask, how voluntary is the exchange? If it turns out that we adopt a free market in kidneys, and all of the sellers are impoverished peasants living in desperate circumstances, do we really think that this is a truly voluntary exchange, or is it coerced by economic necessity? So that's one question. And the other question is, even where there may be no coercion, even where the deal may be the result of free choice between consenting adults, is some important value or intrinsic good degraded or corrupted? Take the kidney example. You might say, apart from coercion, is there an objection to treating the human person and the human body as a collection of spare parts to be used for profit? Or is that at odds somehow with human dignity? That's the corruption. So coercion and corruption are the two broad principles, or the classic case of prostitution, selling one's body for sex. Some object on the grounds that it's not really an expression of freedom. Most of those who engage in prostitution, who sell sex, are under desperate circumstances, whether due to poverty or drug addiction or threat of violence. But there's the further question. Suppose we lived in an equal society where that weren't the case. Some would still object to prostitution on the grounds that it's somehow the wrong way of treating oneself, the wrong way of valuing one's sexual capacities. The coercion argument and the corruption argument.
And the coercion argument, I think, is probably the one which is easiest to accept.
It is. Yeah.
And the corruption is the one where, at minimum, you know, reasonable minds might differ. Sure. And I suppose that's what interests me is how important is subjectivity there? Yeah. If you take one transaction, let's perhaps it's better to talk about exchange of a kidney rather than prostitution. If somebody, a person of adequate means, materially comfortable, is a suitable donor for a kidney. They don't really want the money, but someone offers them $5,000 for it. they provide the kidney, they're happy with it, they get all the benefits of a sense of generosity and helping someone out, but also some money. If that transaction genuinely doesn't change the way they look at the world, change their values, is that really a problem? Why should philosophers or regulators say, well, no, you can't do that, even if it didn't affect you?
Well, I should quickly say, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the philosophers should be kings or even regulator kings. I'm saying that as democratic citizens, we should all debate these questions and decide. Currently, we've done this. Most countries prohibit a free market in kidneys, not because regulators or philosophers have decided, but because democratically we've come to that decision, and maybe we're wrong. Some people think we're wrong. Many economists and others say we could increase the supply, and if it doesn't reflect coercion and desperation, as you say, why not? Well, that's what I think we should debate. And I think in the case of kidneys to save life, it's a closer call. But that depends on the idea that the goal is really saving life. You can push the pure libertarian free market argument for saying, well, who's to judge? Let people decide. Suppose the buyer wanted it not to save his or her life or that of a loved one. Suppose it were an eccentric art dealer who wanted to shellac the kidney and put it on a coffee table as a conversation piece. Then
he's in Tasmania. We know who you're talking about. Yeah.
I mean, then wouldn't most of us say, no, even if there's a willing seller who's not coerced, there's something at odds with human dignity here that we don't want to encourage or promote, even though there might be people willing to do that, and not out of coercion. So we do at some point, I agree that for saving life, it's a close call because there's a great good. But this is my point. We need to evaluate the goods at stake and not simply outsource our moral judgment to markets on the assumption that markets are value-neutral ways of deciding these hard questions for us.
It opens up a very passionate and potentially bitter discussion, though, because while I can hear the arguments, made by philosophers or secular people about the kidney argument, in a way, the arguments seem structurally similar to arguments you might have less affinity with of, for example, old fuddy-duddy celibate religious priests saying that people shouldn't have premarital sex because it degrades their bodies. And all of a sudden you get into a realm of moral censure and judgment where maybe, is there not a virtue to, in a way, removing the passion from the debate by applying market principles?
I think there is a virtue if one lives in the brink of wars of religion, which we don't. And I think that we have overplayed in recent decades the non-judgmental impulse, Julian, that you describe. We so shrink now from engaging in reasoned public debate. It needn't be shrill. It needn't be bitter. We often have this image that to have serious ethical arguments about big contested questions in public is necessarily bitter and partisan shouting match past one another. I think we should overcome our overdeveloped reluctance, Julian, to shrink from moral argument and moral judgment in the public sphere. Are such debates structurally similar to moral arguments made that maybe strike us as narrow or intolerant or contestable? Structurally similar, yes, but that's precisely why we have to attend to the substance. We have to try to work it out together. And I think, and this gets me in trouble with some, and maybe it will with you, I think we should not require democratic citizens to check at the door, to leave behind their moral and even spiritual convictions when they enter the public realm. Because the result of our having done this for the past 3 decades especially, has been a kind of hollowed out public discourse. We have emptied public discourse in democratic societies of big questions, of larger moral meaning. And I don't think that's made for more consensual, pluralistic politics. I think that's made for an empty, hollowed out politics that accounts for the widespread frustration that we see in almost every democracy in the world with the terms of public discourse and with the alternatives the major parties are offering. And I think if we empty and evacuate of any moral content or substance the public realm, what we do is we leave the way open for it to be filled with narrow, intolerant, fundamentalist voices. That's the greater danger. And that's why I think we need a morally more vigorous, more robust kind of public discourse, not only on standard sexual matters and reproductive matters, but also on broader questions of the economy. And one of the purposes of the book is to say we need to have a morally more robust kind of public discourse about justice, about the common good, about what it means to be a citizen, even though it's structurally similar to those ones that we may not like. That's the only way we're going to decide, going to be able to put markets in their place. And it's the only way we're going to make for a better kind of public discourse that gets beyond the narrow, technocratic, managerial talk that leaves people so frustrated today in democracies.
And there's no doubt, I mean, it's hard to disagree with what you diagnose in terms of that frustration and the kind of increased irrationality in some ways and shrillness of the public debate. But I did find myself wondering, reading the book, whether there's a bit of nostalgia in it. You seem to, you write very engagingly about going to, ball games as a kid when it was a low single price ticket, everyone could go there, different races and classes were all mixing. But if I think, and then you say, well, there's been, the state of public discourse is parlous today. If I think back to the state of public discourse those 30, 40 years ago, that did seem to be a time that was far more characterised by moral judgment, exclusion, and I think I'd prefer to live in today's parlous discourse than the old parlous discourse. Are you being a bit pessimistic about the state of play today, the possibility for discourse in all sorts of other forms through technology and the like?
Not pessimistic. I'm skeptical that technology will provide a solution to the emptiness of public discourse. It offers a possibility, but by itself, technology is not going to invigorate our public discourse. That is up to us. That is up to democratic citizens. That depends on our educational institutions. It depends on the media creating forums for serious public discourse that go beyond sound bites, beyond shouting, beyond merely partisan bickering. And so I'm not pessimistic. I'm hopeful, but a big source of my hope is noticing the yearning abroad in the land in almost every democratic society for something better, something more engaged. As for nostalgia, Julian, the baseball story is my one moment of nostalgia. I'll plead guilty to that. But nostalgia can be telling. And this is a story about sports, which are, I think, they do provide a metaphor for the way our societies have changed. Part of what I was pointing out, I was remembering the days, for example, when I was a great sports fan, when I was 12 years old, 13, 14 years old, and I would go, as other kids went, early to the stadium, hoping to get an autograph or a signed ball by one of our heroes. And sometimes I succeeded. I've got a collection of autographs. Now, the players almost never sign because most of the people in the scrum begging for the autographs are not kids. The kids are kind of shoved to the margin. They are brokers who sell these autographed balls and bats and gear on the open market, and it's a massive industry. It's called the memorabilia industry. But if you think about it, what they're selling are nobody's memories. I remember actually, for a few seconds at least, meeting my sports hero. The ball, the signature is a memory of that. If I buy something from a broker or from a shop, it's a bought memory, and a bought memory is not the same as a real one. So that, I think, is a telling case of nostalgia. Or if kids grow up today, to take an example I've heard about here in Australia just since I've come, I may have it wrong, but where televised gambling and bookmaking, essentially on sports, begins to be the predominant way of experiencing the games, that does change over time, especially for young people. Here's a bit of nostalgia again. The traditional experience of rooting for your home team, of sharing the disappointment with a large community when they lose, of the exhilaration of exulting in victory. It's a collective experience. If you're mainly thinking about the odds, it's different. It is different. And it's different in a way that runs right through our society. One thing about the 40 years ago, things were worse. More judgmental, you said, and more exclusionary. I don't think they go together. I think one of the most, if one wants to take, and I don't think there was a golden age of public discourse, but there were moments and glimmers in the past that we can learn from. If we go back 50 or 60 years, in the American political experience, the civil rights movement was fighting against segregation, against exclusion, precisely by drawing on a language that was moral and spiritual, and in the case of Martin Luther King, in some cases, religious. Now, that was a moment when there was a morally engaged, surely contested, fiercely contested, but a morally engaged kind of public discourse connected with a broad social movement about which people did disagree. And so it was not exclusionary, but it was judgmental. It did engage directly with values, with ethics, with moral judgments, with spiritual ideals. And that makes for a contentious, clamorous kind of public discourse, but also, I think, a healthier one.
Unfortunately, time is pressing, so we'll move on. I did find myself thinking about the first election campaign of Barack Obama, where that might have been a similar moment.
Yes.
In an age where the public discourse, seemed to be corroded, but then there was this blossoming of a very different discussion. But let's move on to. I mean, one of the other reasons that you get that tag, which I know you love and insist on, rockstar philosopher. You should have seen his rider, ladies and gentlemen. Unbelievable backstage, all sorts of blue Smarties and the whole thing. That's come about through many things, but in particular, one thing that's been really interesting is the podcasts and televising of the Justice lectures. Right. And I was interested to know, have you always been a good teacher? Or did you refine or change your method and strike on something that we can now see online in the Justice lectures?
I don't think that there's been any dramatic change, certainly not for the sake of television cameras, whose presence we forgot about. We filmed the entire course a few years ago as an experiment in creating free and open access to the classroom. And we put the course, this Justice course that I've been teaching for some years, online and on television, just to see what would happen, really. And we were kind of overwhelmed. I was astonished by the results. But we forgot about the presence of the cameras. The cameras in the classroom not only captured me lecturing, but the students responding and arguing back with me, with one another. That, I think, is what made it work. And after the first 15 minutes of the first day of class, the students forgot, and I forgot pretty much that the cameras were there. So the idea of teaching through engaging students, or readers in this case, in arguments, in dilemmas, in debates.
Yeah, did you always do that?
Yes.
Yeah, from
yeah.
day one.
Yeah, for a simple reason. When I started teaching, I was fairly young and when I started teaching, and I could remember what it was like to be a student sitting in a class. I was a latecomer to philosophy. I tried to take a course as a first-year student in political philosophy, and they gave us these books by famous philosophers, and I couldn't really understand them. They were abstract, distant, remote from... And so I left it aside really until graduate school and came back to it. So when I started teaching, I wanted to teach in a way that would have interested me back when I was a student.
What happens if the students don't ask the right questions? I mean, are there some versions of the justice course where you don't get to the end and find out what justice is because the kids have asked the wrong questions?
Well, usually I ask the questions.
Yeah.
And they offer answers. And some answers are better than others. You'll call me judgmental for saying that. But teachers are nothing if not judgmental. But often, even in a not so perfect answer, there may be a lurking there, a germ of something that will point in an interesting direction. So my job as a teacher is really to try to notice that.
Yeah,
to
and make the best possible form of the argument that's kind of being intuitively put forward. Yeah.
Right. But they do remarkably well, the students. And well, you saw them last night in the Opera House, the people who joined in. They did pretty well, didn't they?
Absolutely. You seem to have a great faith in persuasion and in the idea that you can bring the majority round with a civil discussion. So along those lines, I wanted to ask a couple of things. I mean, first, does that work better on a small scale inside the bubble of the Harvard admissions system? Is there something that kind of makes a better discussion possible from that? And what would your view be if liberal, tolerant values were, well, if they're the correct values, but they're not actually majority values, perhaps a substantial minority value, do we just have to lose that democratic argument if the wrong sorts of laws get passed?
Well, this is a challenge for democracies generally, that the wrong view sometimes prevails. I don't think there's anything distinctive to my view of the matter that makes my account of public discourse especially vulnerable. You might say because I want to bring in questions of the good life, the common good, virtue, justice, that's just asking for trouble or for disagreement and maybe for the imposition of on some of values they may not hold. But my answer to that is, if there were a kind of, if there were a principled politics or way of thinking about a just society or about rights or about toleration that were not open to those dangers, then I might be tempted to say, all right, we'll jettison all of these substantive moral debates and we'll go for that. But then the question is, well, what is that exactly? Well, it's a certain picture of a pluralist society. It's a certain account of how citizens should treat one another. Well, already we're edging up to what looks like an account of the common good and a picture of the good society, which in turn has implications, I think, for what a good citizen is, what is the relation between being a good citizen and living a good life. We're back to Aristotle, in other words, that dangerous stuff, from which I conclude this. Politics is a risky undertaking, under any account, and we should recognize that and not comfort ourselves with the thought that we can somehow find principles that are neutral with respect to the messy but deeply held moral convictions that citizens have.
One of the things I remember from watching the Justice Lecture series was that they were sponsored by Pomegranate Juice, the podcasts. But also I found myself wondering, what does this do for the business model of universities? If you watch the Professor Michael Sandel Justice Lectures, and then you can access the exams or questions online and answer them, why shouldn't you get a Harvard degree at the end of it?
Well, Harvard has now created, as many universities are creating, a platform. I mean, what I'd just been describing was our pilot project before this got going. But now Harvard has a platform called edX that intends to put out lots of these courses. And if you take the exams, and we've put justice on that as well, on that platform, you can take it now if you want to. It's free. And you can take exams, see how you do. You don't get a Harvard degree exactly, but you can get a certificate of mastery from Harvard that you've completed this particular course. Now, over time, some people think that these certificates of mastery, people may accumulate them and actually get an education that way. Whether that will turn out to be the case or not, I don't know. I'm skeptical that it's possible. We wanted to make the course online, provide as many tools that would make it as good as it can be, as close as it could be to being there. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that you can never replace, especially in a humanities course, the personal engagement, whether it's within the same room or at a distance, the personal engagement of teachers and students. Because a lot of what students learn, they learn from one another, they learn by the arguments they have as they leave the lecture hall and go to lunch or go to rugby practice. So I don't think we should kid ourselves into thinking that this can replace the personal relation of teachers and students thinking things through in one another's company.
We'll come to questions in just a couple of minutes. If we could just return to the main themes of the book. Your argument is clearly about classical economics and the view of rational individuals maximising their wealth and the like. Have you had much response to the book from behavioural economists, people who look at economics through a very different lens and probably share a lot of the criticisms that you have of traditional economics?
Right. Behavioral economists have done experiments or studies, empirical studies, that show that people don't always behave according to the standard model of so-called rational economic man. We're not always motivated by self-interest. We don't always respond to cash incentives, for example. I mean, if I were moving suppose I were moving my apartment and I had to lug a very heavy mattress out into a truck, and I asked you, as a friend, would you help me, Julian, lug this mattress out?
How heavy is it?
It's heavy, but you would probably say yes.
Sure.
But suppose I said, Julian, I have this very heavy mattress. I'll pay you $5 if you'll help me lug it out.
Sure.
Well, here we have rational economic man. No, but there would be something, especially if this were a close friend, you'd
don't bother.
You'd think it even a little bit insulting. Well, this is behavioral economists point this out and find examples of this, and I use some examples of this in the book. And so I think that's very valuable, but I want to take it one big step further. It's one thing to notice cases where introducing a cash incentive backfires because it crowds out non-market values. It's a further question to ask, and this really is my question, jumping off from those experiments and those results. How important are the non-market values that are being crowded out here? And are they important enough so that so that we should forego the efficiency gains of the market mechanism? And that takes economics beyond even what the behavioral economists do, onto explicitly normative terrain, and calls into question the idea, which I do want to challenge, that economics is a value-neutral science of human behavior. I don't think it's conceived itself that way, for the most part, in the mainstream, for some time. But going all the way back to Adam Smith, economics was understood as a branch of moral and political philosophy. And I think we would do well to reconnect economics to broader questions of moral and political philosophy.
We're going to move now to
fact, if
some
you want,
interaction.
you can.
Yes.
Oh, no,
but we thought we'd... Sorry?
If you think we don't have time,
Oh, no, we've got time.
Okay,
yeah.
fine.
Well, I thought we'd split the engagement with the audience into the traditional questions from you, which we'll do in a few minutes. But since we have Professor Michael Sandel here, and his kind of international calling card is these sorts of structured discussions, we thought we'd kind of effectively enroll you all in Harvard University for 10 minutes, and we'll give you some sort of certificate of mastery if they go all right at the end.
All right, you'll be the judge.
Okay, all right.
You'll be judgmental.
More than happy to.
All right, shall I put to you a scenario about markets and see what people think? Yeah. It's a true story. The Atlantic walrus in the Arctic is an endangered species. It's a defenseless creature, and it was overhunted. And in the early 20th century, Canada banned the walrus hunt, but they made an exception for the native population, the Inuits, who had built their entire way of life around the walrus hunt. For centuries, they said they could carry on. They would be given an annual quota of walruses. They could carry on hunting them. All went well till the 1990s. The Inuit group of the Inuit people came to the Canadian government with a proposal. Suppose you let us sell the right to kill our walruses within the quota to big game hunters. The quota will not increase, no more walruses will be killed, but we'll make some money because we will be able to serve as the tour guides. We'll attract wealthy hunters from Texas mostly, and maybe some from Australia. And
Western Australia.
Western Australia. And everyone will gain. No more walruses will be lost. The hunters will be able to hunt their prey. They will have the thrill of shooting a walrus. We will keep the walrus meat and prepare it just as we've always done, and we will make some money. And so the government agreed. Now, wealthy big game hunters come and pay $6,000, $6,500 for the thrill of shooting a walrus. Standard economic reasoning, it's efficient, everybody's better off, no one's worse off. I just want to see what people think about, if you were in charge, if you had to vote on whether to permit the exemption, how many would be in favor? Raise your hands. Of allowing them to sell the quota, sell the right to hunt and shoot their walruses. How many would be in favor?
All right, if you could leave, please.
How many against? Most people are against. All right, here's a puzzle. What's wrong with, why would you be against? Everybody is better off. Nobody is worse off. No more walruses are being lost than would be the case otherwise. Why does the great majority oppose this selling the right to shoot a walrus? What's wrong with it? Yeah.
Well, originally they were given the quota as an exemption because they wanted to save the walrus.
Right.
So our intention is to save.
The intention was to save the walrus from extinction. That's true, and the walrus is still being saved from extinction.
Yeah, but the reason why they were given the extinction was that it had something to do with the continuation of the culture of the Inuit.
The reason they were given the exemption was to respect the continuation of the culture, the Inuit culture. That's true. Well, but now they're saying we're preserving our culture and making a little money on the side. What's wrong with that?
Well, maybe then the government could just give them the money without having to pay them.
Oh, maybe the government could just give them the money and save all the walruses. All right. Yes.
It's probably unlikely that the hunters from wherever will be wanting to stay in the same accommodation as the traditional Inuits.
Well,
So
then
there'll
you
be other
could build
things.
lodges for them.
Yes, that would be probably my major concern. The implications
You
around
don't want to
that.
build luxurious lodges for hunters from Western Australia. Why not? Why is that?
Well,
Why is that such a
if
grievous?
If the story started with preserving...
I see. It might disrupt the
traditional-
way of life. All right. Let's take one more objection, and then we'll hear from some brave soul, I hope, on the other side to respond to these objections. Who else? Okay, toward the back. Yes.
The reason for introducing the ban was to teach, I guess, the lesson that killing walruses is not a good thing, or hunting
I see.
per se is not a good thing. So allowing the Inuits, because of their culture, was the exemption there, but allowing hunters to do it for a sport
Yes.
teaches the greater community that it's okay to kill for
I
sport.
see. That's interesting. So it teaches what you would consider to be a
wrong
perverse,
lesson.
the wrong lesson. What's your name?
Pamela?
Pamela?
Yep.
Now, notice, Pamela has just made a judgmental argument, Julian. Though I submit that it's difficult to explain what, if anything, is wrong with the concession for the paid walrus hunt without leaning on a judgmental idea like Pamela's. Let me hear, now that we've heard some powerful arguments against, whether there is someone who favors it who has a reply to these arguments. Yes.
Economic argument. It's a bit like Aboriginal people having an income from their own traditional land. If the Inuit get to spend the money and decide, and there's no extra quota, I'm no problem with that.
All right, so the Inuit get the extra money. Nobody is harmed. Standard economic argument says, why not? Why not? And to that, you might add the idea, which has been suggested by Julian earlier in the discussion, who are we, or who is the government, or why should the political community as a whole, democratic though it be, pass judgment on what Pamela says is a bad message, a bad lesson, that somehow hunting, and they are quite helpless, by the way, there's little sport in it, hunting a helpless creature, is wrong. It's a bad attitude. It's something we don't want to encourage. Well, first, I want to thank all of you who have participated in this quick mini discussion, this discussion about philosophy and walrus hunting. But the conclusion I would draw from it, Julian, is, well, here we have a clear case of standard economic reasoning. Everybody's better off. No one is worse off. No more walruses are lost. And yet, the strongest argument against seems to be one that says the desire of these hunters to engage in the thrill of shooting a large, defenseless creature may not be worthy of being fulfilled, may actually be a disagreeable attitude, a bad attitude, and maybe that's why we shouldn't permit it, together with the moral argument or the judgment about what is the purpose of the concession in the first place. That too is judgmental. That it's one thing to respect the Inuit's traditional way of life and culture. That has some value and meaning. It's quite another thing to convert that respect for their native culture into a cash concession in killing on the side. Thank you for helping kind of frame this discussion with a small but I think telling example of how we need to think through dilemmas such as these.
And that's just, again, a small example of what a wonderful experience it is watching Michael's lectures. And even though you can't be in the room and you've said that there's something that's lost by not quite being there, I can speak from personal experience to say it is tremendously engaging and thought-provoking, and you should all do it. We've got time now for you to ask Michael a few questions, and we'll start with you, sir.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Julian, for what I think the French would describe as a good being a good animateur. I'm thinking about value-free economic decisions. I'm wondering, in classical terms, what Aristotle would say about charging for essential services like electricity, gas, fuel, etc., water.
Well, there are two possible objections to charging for the essentials of life. One objection is that those who are poor may not be able to afford them, and if there's no safety net, no social safety net or public provision of essential goods, then an injustice is done, an unfairness to those who are without access to the essentials of life. There's a second objection, which is not exactly about fairness to the poor. It's about community and membership in a common life. There may be certain goods that are so central to the common life we share that to deprive some of access to them would not only create a hardship for them, but would also effectively be a form of exclusion from the common life. And so the case for free public schools depends as much on this argument, creating a sense of shared citizenship, as on the first argument, providing everyone access to the necessities of life.
I agree with all the things that you've said about the discipline of economics, and have actually run a series of critiques myself. But I'm curious because my critiques also come from the fact that economics, because it is based on the idea of exchanges and of monetarized exchanges, absolutely leaves out all of those areas of life which are, in a sense, domestic, female, household, exchange, which is based on, on an excluded thing. So I suppose I'm curious, I did get your book and flick through it fairly quickly, whether or not you've actually considered putting a solid feminist lens on, not the feminist lens that says we want to be equal to men, because that's a low level of ambition, as we've always been saying. But the one that says we want to include in those things that are important, relationships, emotions, feelings, judgments, values, and that economics tries to do that in a way that is essentially macho and feeds into a particular view of masculinity.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for that.
Australia's leading Eva Cox impersonator at the back.
Thank you for that. The work that we sometimes refer to as women's work often does not show up in GDP and can't be captured by a narrow cost-benefit analysis. Now, there are different strands of feminist thought, as I'm sure you know, that can follow from that. There are some who say, therefore, the way to deal with this problem is to try to commodify traditional women's work, to somehow enable the price system to capture the value of childcare and of household work, because that's the only way of valuing work that traditionally has been women's work. And then there are others, including others within the feminist community, who say, no, that would actually make things worse. That would be, to borrow your phrase, taking the wooden, macho, cost-benefit analysis view of life and extending it into the family and into the relation of parents and children. Better to provide conditions where men and women can share and share more equally in family life, in the raising of children, in the provision of care, and not try to resort to putting a price tag on those activities for the sake of valuing them. And I lean toward the second. I think we should try to find and revive and encourage ways of honoring and valuing and recognizing important social contributions, including in the areas of care, that don't require that we marketize them or commodify them. I think that's a bigger challenge, but I think it will make for a better kind of family life, and I think it will be better for women.
Any other questions?
If the market starts to value the Harvard certificates for the free online courses, do you envisage then Harvard would start to charge for them?
I worry about that.
I'm wondering if you think there's an ethical difference between selling your labour and selling your body parts, and if so, why?
Well, it's a good question, because we take for granted that people should be able to sell their labor in whatever way, shape, or form, and we sometimes draw a sharp distinction between selling one's labor and selling one's body. But there are many kinds of labor that call that distinction into question. Sweatshop labor, is that dignified? Is that consistent with human dignity? What about the use of the body? Some would say the sale of the body or the image of the body involved in modeling or commercial advertising, never mind prostitution. I think there are many forms of labor about which we could reasonably ask, and historically people have asked, is this labor contract consistent with respect for human persons, or consistent with respect for human dignity or democratic citizenship? And there may be many jobs and roles, even in our society today, where that question could fairly be asked.
I want to ask a little bit about commoditizing. Is there some way we can go towards putting a price on externalities such as environmental and social externalities? I guess a price on carbon and pollution is one attempt at that. How far do you think that can actually go, and then use the market forces to bring in the social environmental values that we might want to be part of that transaction?
Right. All right, thank you for the question. Sometimes might it be the case that market mechanisms, putting a price on an externality like carbon emissions, could help solve a problem and maybe encourage good environmental norms? Yes, that can happen. I think the best way of doing that is through a carbon tax, which in a way does put a price on an externality. So I'm very much in favor of carbon taxes to achieve this. I think it's a trickier case when we're talking about tradable pollution permits or tradable emission credits. In some settings, this works and does not erode important attitudes, especially when the primary actors are companies within a domestic economy engaging in carbon trading. But where I have objected to the use of tradable pollution permits is in the global context, when the actors are countries. In the Kyoto Summit on the environment, the US was insisting that any obligations for reducing emissions would have to be coupled with the right to buy and sell, to outsource the reductions, so that, say, if a wealthy country were assigned a certain level of reduction, they could meet those obligations either by reducing their own emissions or by paying some other country to reduce theirs. I think this risks undermining the sense of shared sacrifice and shared responsibility for climate change if the effect is to allow rich countries to buy their way out of their obligations to reduce their own emissions. Because I think the ethic of shared sacrifice has to underwrite a shared global ethic on the environment. So I think we have to be very careful about what mechanisms we use to deal with externalities such as carbon emissions. Could I make one other observation about economic reasoning? There are some people, some economists, actually quite distinguished economists, who listen to the kind of arguments that I've raised and that others have raised, about the sometimes corrupting effect of market thinking and market reasoning. They respond as follows. They say, look, markets have a great unacknowledged virtue. They conserve on the scarce resource of altruism, generosity, fellow feeling, and solidarity. These generous virtues are in short supply, they argue. And so economics does everyone a favor, even moralists like me and perhaps many of you, by helping us not spend down recklessly the scarce supply of altruistic or civic motivation, so it will be available intact when we really need it. Now, I think this is, for anyone who's not a professional economist, this is a strange way of looking at the world. And yet this is a deeply influential idea. I mean, imagine if you applied this to your own marriage or to your relation with your partner. Would you really do better to ask little of one another, to hoard your love until you really needed it? Or, it's as if altruism and civic virtue and solidarity were like, as if these sentiments were like fossil fuels that are depleted with use. I think it's more likely, I think that metaphor is misleading, however influential. I think the generous virtues, especially civic virtue and generosity and fellow feeling and solidarity, I think these are less like commodities that are depleted with use and more like muscles that are strengthened with the exercise. And that, I think we need to exercise those muscles, those virtues, more strenuously if we're to achieve more just societies that aim at the common good.
Well, as you can all hear, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Sandel, thank you so much.